writers. So there's a lovely painting of Shah Jahan sitting with his son Dara Shikoh, little Dara Shikoh sitting with him with his calligraphic practice. And to produce all this spectacular work, I'm guessing the calligrapher had to spend long hours in confinement and confine himself in isolation. And I think, yes.
You know, Riya, I just want to talk about a very basic understanding. You know, the entire experience of God in the Muslim tradition is through the word. Just like the, we can say that the Hindu experience is, you know, they find God in the idol, or for Christianity it's Christ. For Islam, the experience of God has been the written word. And, you know, this great man called Syed Nasr, who is the authority on Islamic art, I really love what he said once. And that one line drove me mad all night. And I just reflected on it and reflected on it. He says, ugliness is a human invention. God created beauty. And what defines and what inspires Islamic art is the one hadith, this, you know, of saying of Prophet, which is Allahu Jamilun Muhibbul Jamal. God is beautiful and He created beauty. There is nothing in nature, nothing that God created that is ugly. And so the whole experience of calligraphy was to really adorn everything, to create beauty around you, to create beauty in the mosque, to create beauty on the carpets, to create beauty in your letters, to create beauty in your speech, in your etiquette, in your shawls, just to create beauty. That was what really inspired this whole experience of calligraphy. And if you go to a mosque, you actually find that it has very little adornment inside. There might be beautiful domes, but inside you just really have calligraphy. And Nasr explains it in a very beautiful way. He says there is emptiness in the mosque. You just have these words. Because we find experience of God in the void. If He is there, then we are not there. If we are there, He is not there. And I think even if you look at Islamic calligraphy, you find the use of spaces, the voids in between the words. And Ali said that the whole universe was really in the bay, in the dot of the bay. So letters in Islam are very, very mystical. In fact, when you write the word Muhammad, it's actually in the shape of, the mystics have read it, it is in the shape of a man in prostration, in sajda.
On that note of...
So yeah, so I just wanted to share these
and on that
ideas
note of surrounding oneself
with beauty.
Could we go to the next slide? I'll just, yes. Okay, so the calligrapher's pens. The calligrapher's pens are a matter of great intrigue, I've always thought. And I've always thought that the practice of calligraphy involved surrounding oneself with their pen cases, cutters, burnishers, because that was, when you get, what do you call it, when you get taken over by your junun, your passion, you want to be surrounded by what you love and what also kills you, because you are living with it in confinement, you're just spending all of your, every waking minute with it. And into this deeply rich, elusive world of the calligrapher, where he's surrounded by ivory pens, lapis blues, and ceramic cases. Carl, would you talk a little bit about the blameworthy qualities that one should avoid, or how to bring moderation in soul to become a calligrapher and this?
Well, most of the treatises that we have about the practice of writing are technical. And they describe the formation of the letters and the inks and the physical aspects and the proportions. But occasionally there is a text which talks about the internal meditation and, in fact, the ethical qualities that must be present to be a successful master of script. And so there's a wonderful treatise called Adab al-Mashq, the manners or ethics of writing practice, in which Baba Shah Isfahani in the 17th century gave an incredibly articulate expression of this process. And so we see it as a spiritual discipline, which means that by cultivating, it's Sufi language, talking about the cultivating the praiseworthy qualities that come from God and trying to eliminate the blameworthy qualities that you have acquired. And this will appear in your writing, and people will be able to tell.
Baba Shah Isfahani also likes the paper from Deccan, so he's quite, he would be happy to have some of his manuscripts in India today. Or
Absolutely, yes.
on that note, there seems also to be a conflict between the written word and figurative art. And just when we were writing the summary for this session, we quoted Abul Fazl, the Wazir spokesperson of Emperor Akbar, who seems to be in two minds and finally places painting below calligraphy and concedes that painting is inferior to calligraphy. I would like to ask Goswamy sir about how does that thought exist, how does that thought coexist in India, where there's a rich painting and sculptural tradition, and yeah.
Let me first explain why I am here. I should say, not explain, but mention it. What was it? Somebody said, I am the black swan of trespass upon alien waters. I know remarkably little about calligraphy, but I have some interest in it.
Makes two of us.
I'm here to learn, essentially, rather than to explain anything or elucidate. But two questions which come to my mind. First of all, I'd like to go back to Abul Fazl, whom you mentioned. And as an art historian, I was very interested in that chapter in the Ain-e-Akbari on the arts of writing and painting. And as you correctly said, he starts off with a very, very clear and more or less political statement that of the two arts, I'll talk about calligraphy, writing first, because it is superior of the two arts. I would have no problem with that at all, right? None whatsoever. But what he says always has moved me greatly about writing. You know, I mean, the eloquence, which he talks about calligraphy, the kind of very precise, sharp formulations. The word is spiritual geometry, right? It comes from the pen of invention. It is black in itself, but spreads light. It is stationary, yet soaring upwards, right? It goes on in this particular strain. How extraordinary is the beauty of the word, right? And so on. I wish I had the passage in front of me, and I'm moved by it, very, very deeply moved by it. And he talks about technicalities, madat, dawayar, and so on and so forth like that, and something which I know very little about. But the fact that calligraphy, which is different from scripting, right? Kushnavisi is something else, and writing, scribes are different from calligraphers. How highly regarded it was. Aapne farmaya, the titles which were given to these great calligraphers, Zarri Khalam of the golden pen, Ambari Khalam, right? Musk pen or something like this and so on. Mushki Khalam, something like that. Titles like that, which tell you of how extraordinarily high calligraphy was really retained and held at that particular time. But I have two questions. When a great calligrapher sits down to write, apart from the sacred word, right, which of course is the origin of it all, so to speak. And then, of course, the praise of Allah and so on. It's just wonderful. But when it comes to secular texts, right, how much did the calligrapher enter the sacred text, the secular text? Was he familiar with what it contained, or is it only drawing, letters, right, and words, etc., on a piece of paper? You know, the reason why I've asked is this. When a painter paints, right, he has to familiarize himself with the object, with the theme, with whatever it is. Does the calligrapher have the same ability or the same desire to enter a particular text? Right? That is question one. Second, these great penmen, right? Did they all come from abroad, from Iran, from Baghdad or something like this? Or were there great penmen? No, Muhammad Hussain calls him the Kashmiri, right? No, he's come from Kashmir, of course, and that's how the description. But whether he was originally from Kashmir, or he had settled in Kashmir and so on and so forth, we don't know. We have no notion at all. Are any biographies of the great calligraphers of India, I'm not talking about what Minorsky wrote about the great calligraphers elsewhere and so on, are they known? Are you familiar with them? I'm learning, I want to learn. And if they were they only concentrated in the north? There were some in the Deccan, of course, right, at the Sultanates, Jaipur, Golconda, etc., and so on. But were they mostly confined to the courtly circles, or calligraphers also worked on their own in private sort of commissions or something like this? That's what I would like to know.
Well, if I might,
Please.
the text that I was quoting when I told that story about the poem
Yeah.
is the earliest Persian treatise about the Arabic alphabet. And it was written in the Deccan in 1454 by an author who was from Persia, from Shiraz. But he came there to become part of the court and as a disciple of the Ni'matullahi Sufis of the Deccan. But is the microphone not functioning?
Maybe just.
Okay. Am I better now? Yeah. Okay. We have certain histories, even of the reign of Aurangzeb, which have lists and descriptions of the calligraphers. They are not usually distinguished by nationality, because that's a question we are much more interested in today. But I mentioned that text that was written in the Deccan in the 15th century. It's an important reminder that national identities are not what was experienced at the time as crucial. And the inscriptions that we find in Bidar, such as the Chowkhandi tomb of Shah Khalilullah, which was probably composed by the author of this text. That's described by Schimmel and others as one of the most magnificent Arabic inscriptions in India. And I think it's one of the glories of India. And let's not forget that the most iconic building from India, everybody in the world knows and can identify, the Taj Mahal. It has 29 chapters from the Quran inscribed on the surface. So Arabic is a language of India. And I might add, according to the 18th century author Azad Bilgrami, since Adam, when he was kicked out of heaven, landed in Sri Lanka, of course on Adam's Peak, we are all Indians.
Yeah.
So I'm happy about that.
Also, may I just add, when you, we know the names of the calligraphers who worked on the Taj. I think a lot of this obviously came in along with when the Indo-Persian, entire arts came about, whether it was architecture when Humayun brought in the all the artisans and for the and the laborers and the so I think it was, and he's right, I don't think we know their names so much because I think what we're really concerned with, or correct me if I'm wrong, Professor Ernst, is that ultimately it's their words that last. It's not really the artist, because remember, when it is about God, it lasts. When it's about the person, it doesn't. And I think that's another underlying theme of Islamic art, is because it was never made for yourself. It was made to glorify the names of Allah or the verses of the Quran. So who did it was, I think if that was important, we wouldn't see that today. And also for the secular, when you talk about the secular, I think, again, another Islamic belief is that all knowledge comes from God. So there is no real division as such. For instance, when I cook, I see it as my, and that's again, Salman will, always tells the young people that make your work your remembrance of God. So even if I'm writing an article and I'm using my pen for it, I don't see it as different than worship. So, everything in the Sufi tradition, whether you work or you eat or you cook or you paint or you write, it might be directly a form of prayer or indirectly a form of prayer. So when you begin to see your entire life as worship, as ibadah, so it's very difficult for a devout Muslim to really separate the secular from the religious.
Sorry, if I can just extend Professor Goswami's question there and just self-reference myself. India is often seen as a syncretic, is upheld, held up as this fertile ground for syncretic traditions, where all these traditions came in, merged with the local culture and gave rise to a different tradition. And in light of that, I'd like to ask, were there many scripts that were innovated by Indian practitioners in India, perhaps, which were more rooted in the Indian context? Did they ever make it to the list of mainstream scripts? If yes, no, why not, why?
Yeah, I would add to that, because I was coming on to that. I'm glad that this question was asked. Interestingly, a few months back, I was in England. I was invited at the Bradford Literature Festival. And after that, I took time to visit the British Library in London. And through a common friend who happened to be a graduate from SOS University in Persian and Arabic stream, he got access to the inner zone of the British Library where not the visitors are allowed. So he took me there, and I asked him to specifically if we can go through some of the Chishti manuscripts during the Mughal or pre-Mughal time. So he took me inside to that private area and displayed about 15 books, originally handwritten books. One of them, of course, which I was looking for, was Munisul Arwa, the original memoir of Jahanara, which she wrote about her visit to Ajmer Sharif and different awliyas in India. On the same table, you would be very happy to know this, that there was a Persian and Arabic manuscript book. I opened it. At first glance, I would have thought it would be a Sufi treatise. But when I read it, the first beginning was Om Namah Shivaya. It was the Upanishad, which was written during the time, let's say, Darasiko, when he wrote the Majmu' al-Bahrain, and it was written in the most immaculate way of writing Arabic or Persian calligraphy with gold leaves around it, and the entire book was so preserved there. And I was pleasantly surprised that this was the India that we never even actually was conscious about what religious text and which script are we using. That is the great legacy that we all have come through. And in those days, we were much more connected and understanding and even learning from each other. So the entire Upanishad was penned down in beautifully calligraphic content. I wanted to take a picture, but they said no. It's only the government can write to the library to have a digital copy. They won't even give it to private collectors. And it was all locked down, William, you can have a look at that. It was locked down for 100 years in the British Library. Only this person, because he could go through that, he spread that book, those valuable books in front of me. So there was a very, very active culture. As Sadia Appa has said that, the whole idea of writing beautifully and expressing your longing towards the beloved is the expression that comes down from the words of the Hadith Qudsi that Allahul Jamil wa Hubbul Jamal. So the calligraphers, they were of course mystics, and they made the writing not as their display of talent or how beautifully they can write. It was their zikr. It was their way to connect to God and share that longing and that moment of peace which they get while writing these beautifully scribed words. I mean, like you go to Ajmer Sharif, there is a Dhai Ka Jhopra, 11th century monument. You come to Qutub Minar, again 11th. So pre-Mughal also, the calligraphic content, as you started with the Kufic element, was very much prominent in Indian subcontinent. And we're talking about 11th century India, which has stretched from all the way from Afghanistan to the shores of Myanmar, even beyond that. So it really excelled here. And there are a lot of contemporary calligraphers that we invite every year to Ajmer Sharif who are doing the active calligraphy in Delhi, Nizamuddin Dargah, at Ajmer Sharif, and they are from Saharanpur, right from the heartlands of India, and they're excelling there, but they're unknown. I'll come on that with the Sufi Rang, how we try to do that. But the idea what to ask the question is there are very much contemporary artists. There was a time, we could say even before independence, where the small Nawabs used to patronize these artists. Look, if a calligrapher is writing a Quran or a text by hand, it would take literally a year to write that manuscript. Who would support for a year the family of that calligrapher? No one will do that today. He has to work. So earlier he was patronized, okay, if you are a fankar of writing calligraphy or any fun, that's how the folk art thrived in India. That it was patronized by the state or the Nawab or the Subas. We have Professor Ken here with us. He has documented those kind of artwork beautifully. So during that time, it was thriving. Why it is diminishing now? Because there's no patronization. The neighbors won't know that they have an amazing calligrapher in the next home. That's the irony of contemporary world.
In Ajmer Sharif, there is a handwritten Quran by Khwaja Moinuddin Chishti. So, calligraphy is ultimately the response of the human soul to the divine message. And that is why it is actually called sacred geometry. And you have the arabesque, which is, the infinite patterns and, all kinds of mystic meanings that you see and all inspired by nature and, whatever. So, yes, so that is what is so beautiful. And, so the mystics were writing, and anybody who could, children are first taught their lesson at the age of 4. There is, even my child went through it. Every child goes through a Bismillah ceremony at the age of 4, which is their first Quranic lesson. So they're given a traditional reed pen. They're made to say, recite a verse from the Quran, and they write their first letter. I remember my son when he was throwing a pen, he was young, and I said, don't ever do that because the pen is sacred. There is a chapter called Surah Qalam in the Quran, and God has honored the pen, and He's honored writing. And I wrote that story, and many parents, many mothers have come to me sometimes and said, we love that story, and we tell it to our children, because you just angrily throw the pen. No, the pen is sacred for us.
Absolutely.
We have a written message.
And I think that no one is immune to it, especially in India, where even Kashmiri Pandits are writing Persian. So Abdul Halim Sharar, for example, writes this wonderful passage about Kashmiri Pandits who've settled in Lucknow, but they can still write the script perfectly well, and they can calligraph them in 4 different styles.
It's an art.
It's an art.
Let me add that figures indicate that in the year 1600, in Persia proper, there were perhaps 150,000 readers of Persian. In India at the time, there were 1 million.
Just imagine.
And there were tens of thousands of Hindu secretaries, munshis, who had to be trained deeply in Persian poetry and ethics. And I think this actually does open up the secular in a very interesting way, because they were not becoming Muslims, but they were deeply engaged with this practice, And I'm thinking of a particular Hindu munshi who died in 1850s, but who was described in his obituary as a master of the 6 scripts.
Hafta kalam.
Of course, it's a conservative tradition. It's not about innovation and developing novelties, but mastering the classics. And I'll speak to you about this munshi after our session.
Salman, coming back to, sorry, please, go on.
And what Professor Karl has said, this is was so much prominently done, and they were not even conscious about the origin of the script. It was very much Indianized. Even the language of Urdu that has came up through these amalgamation of a script, it is very much Indian. It is not a particular, there is a wrong conceived notion that it is like coming from the Muslim tradition. It is very much from the land of India.
Shahmukhi, the idea of...
Absolutely. Even today, my grandfather's friends in Ajmer who are from the Sikh community, Mohinder uncle, he rings me up, he's over 80 years old. He rings me up and calls me, Salman, do you have any old Urdu magazine? I miss that language because they're not available anymore on the stand. So they used to write in that language, they used to converse in that language, and they used to cherish the beauty of writing.
There's a
And they were
Deccan
all
Urdu.
handwritten because
All
it was,
handwritten.
my father helped develop the calligraphy script, the in-page, which was the first Urdu calligraphy. And I don't know if you know, but I come from a family where we had Shama, Sushma, Bano, Khilona. So there were Urdu magazines, and when I tell my son that they were all handwritten, the entire magazine was handwritten, he can't believe it.
So
I mean,
even
for
newspapers.
years, newspapers, and there was just so much art. We had an entire calligraphy section in our office, and what illustrations, and it was all film, and it was literature, but yet, I think for them, whatever they wrote was their worship, and that's what I meant. I'm not talking, when I say that it's difficult to separate from the secular, I must make a little more clear that when I talk about secular, I mean as opposed to God, not in the Indian understanding of secular. If we were to take that, yes,
So
it is a very
Farmans,
secular
for
tradition.
example, are
So when
secular manuscripts.
So, you know, composite
Yeah,
culture,
yeah.
the Ganga Jamni's Tehzeeb in India is a gift of the Sufis and the Bhaktas.
Yes.
This is all the mystics and the, you know, and the Sufis and the Bhaktas and the, you know, yogis coming together. So that's very much part of our tradition. So that is, yeah.
Two observations and a brief question. When Humayun comes back to India from Iran, after he had been exiled and so on, we, as an art historian, I know a little about that. When he comes back from Kabul and so on, via Kabul, then 3 painters join him, right? 3 very well-known painters of that particular time. We know the names, Abdul Samad and Mullah Dost and so on. There's no calligrapher who comes with him from Iran to India.
There's Dast Muhammad on the screen right now as we're talking, yes.
Yeah. Mullah Dost. Now, second observation, I mean, I'm struck by that. You know, if calligraphy is that important, I mean, Humayun was a bibliophile, right? We know that. And ironically, he died falling from his library downstairs, right, like this and so on. The second thing, when we have albums, Mughal albums, right? Now, the obverse is a painting. The reverse is calligraphy. Right, on the same folio, right? Yes. Now, when you turn it like this, first you look at the painting, and then you look at the text at the back. They're unrelated most often. Yes. I mean, there may be a sort of a quatrain from Sadi or from, Hafiz or something like that, completely unrelated. So obviously, both arts were valued greatly and so on, but I am struck by the fact that here, the painting, in a certain sense, obverse is what you see first, and reverse is when you see a little later. But the question, very brief, the question of a completely ignorant person. And that is, we have in Sanskrit, the word for a letter is akshar. Akshar, naksharati iti aksharaha, that which cannot be destroyed. Right? Which cannot be obliterated, akshar, is akshar. That is the literal meaning of the word, that which cannot be destroyed. or cannot dwindle or something like that. Is there a comparable word in Arabic or in Persian for a letter which cannot be destroyed?
Could you say more about why it cannot be destroyed? Because its essence is somehow beyond.
Yeah, I mean, it's a notional thing, right? Once you have written it down, then it is there permanently. And if you speak it out, right, then it becomes a part of the heavens and mountains.
Well, I think what Sadia referred to about the nuqta. You see, the saying, the dot, the nuqta. There's a saying of Ali that the entire Quran is contained in the Bismillah, and the entire Bismillah is contained in the letter Ba, and the entire Ba is contained in the dot. Now, there are people who have focused so much on these letters that the word for letter is huruf. There is a whole mystical movement called the hurufis. And beyond them, there was a group called the dot people, the nuqtawis.
Nuqtachi or Nuqta?
Nuqtawis. Yeah. And they were very active in the time of Akbar. And so I think there is a sense in which you can find its continuity with the eternal.
You know, it's very interesting that in the Quran, there are these mystic letters where nobody knows what they stand for. And it begins the Quran after the Fatiha, which is really a prayer. It's like, you know, Alif, Lam, Mim. So when you come to the Quran, you have to approach it, I don't know. If you come with arrogance, the Quran doesn't speak to you, because the first letters, we don't know. We don't know what they stand for. And there are 28 letters which we don't know. So it's very, you know, there's if you look at it from the spiritual understanding, it's very deep, and it's, you know, we can only just maybe, we really can't, we don't know. That's the thing. I'd also like to just talk about color, because I am very fascinated with color. If you look at the old Qurans and the colors and the illuminations, the blues, the yellows, the gold. So there was this whole Sufi, there is this philosophy and this understanding of the Jamal and the Jalal, the beauty and the wrath. And so the colors come into play, you know, the Jamal, the blue, and the wrath, the gold. And, you know, they say that the sky is blue and it's like a tent. We're sitting in the Mughal tent, but we're all under God's tent, which is actually blue. So that has been understood as the color of mercy, Rahmah, because the layers of atmosphere and, you know, which are protecting us from the whole magnificence of God's glory and light, which we cannot, because Moses fainted after he saw just a, you know, just a zarra, just a really, just a glimpse of that. And so it comes to us filtered. You know, we are alive because we can't take God's light, and we have to have it through layers and layers and layers of blue. So blue is understood as the color of mercy, and yellow, gold is wrath. So if you look at calligraphies, you find in the old Qurans, they have, you know, the play of colors, the play of letters, the boundaries, the borders, the florals, everything is really, has a very deep mystic, and you know, Sufis have spent entire lives, I mean, like he said correctly, I mean, people have spent their entire lives just trying to understand the nukta, the dot. So, you know, these are oceans and oceans and oceans of wisdom and love and compassion and knowledge. And like the Quran says, that if all the trees became paper, or if the pens, even then you cannot write God's praise. The oceans
provided ink.
So, you know, we really have to begin from the assumption of complete humility and submission that we don't know.
Just one observation that I hold my
mystical
peace.
science about what you ask about the letters. There's a whole mystical science within the Quran itself and the written letters. That Quran is a living book, and every time you read it, new revelations come to you upon your own understanding and upon your own journey towards the divine. At the same time, we have Ilm Jafri, where every word denotes to a numerical value. Like when we write, you must have observed when you write 786. So what does that 786 mean? It means Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So there is a whole science which we call it Abjad. So the mystical interpretation
Even
of
by
the
Imam
Sufis,
Jafar, I think, right? Also
from Imam Jafar Sadiq, Ilm
Jafar
Jafri. So the whole science of
Numbers.
letters, as more you go deeper, it reveals to you in a form that it takes closer to the divine aspect within your longing, at the same time belonging through these revealed letters.
Please
Go ahead.
Wait, if I could return to the question, that you made a fascinating observation, Dr. Goswamy, about the pages that have a painting on one side and writing on the other. And in today's museums, those are generally cataloged as paintings. But as Riya pointed out, the penmanship, the calligraphy, was considered more valuable. We know that the valuation of the manuscripts, John Seiler has a wonderful article about this, which shows how much money everybody was paid who contributed to a manuscript. And the person who does the script is at the top of the scale, and the painter is way down there. So perhaps we should say to the museums, we should classify these as writing that happens to have a picture on the back of it.
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Just an observation which may be of no interest to anybody in particular. But on manuscripts, some imperial manuscripts, Mughal period, there are some inscriptions in the hand of Jahangir and some in the hand of Shah Jahan. Their hands are very similar, and most people mistake one for the other. But Jahangir never used a dot, and Shah Jahan always uses nuqtas.
Uses?
Uses the
Nuqtas.
nukta.
So is that
Never.
Is that diacritical marks though?
No,
Because
no,
oftentimes
it
Persian
is a
was written
diacrit-
without
no,
diacritical
it's
marks.
not. It's not. There's some thought behind it.
That's not making it easy for other people.
No, it isn't. It isn't. But I mean, I can show you a number of manuscripts
And
which have these
also-
inscriptions.
It's also
the
very
style of
interesting.
writing, if you look at the writings of Arabic or Persian writing, there will be no zair, zabar, and
It
even
was
nukta.
actually
it's
added
not
much
that.
later. Very
Without
interesting
even
that the
dots
Even
sometimes.
dot, no dot.
Then you have to
Yeah.
know the text before
Yeah.
you can read it.
No dot. Jahangir never uses a dot.
Also,
Well, you know, the dot, the pesh and the lines and all these markings, जिसको हम zabar और pesh कहते हैं, is actually were put much later, I think, by
For the non-Arabs.
Hajjaj, Yusuf
It was
Hajjaj.
Yeah, the
much-
oldest script doesn't have anything like that.
because this was when Islam was spreading to the to non-Arab speaking countries,
Different
and
languages.
during the Ottoman Empire, they realized that you need to put markings, diacritic markings, because otherwise people will get it wrong and pronounce it wrong. And in fact, it's very interesting. One of the arguments that I use how to explain that Sharia is dynamic is because this was a big argument that whether the Quran should be written at all. It was written, collected much later, whether the markings should be there, whether it should be printed. All these have been movement of, I see this as a mobile Sharia, a dynamic Sharia, because fatwas were given that this is not to be done.
in that context of Jahangir versus Shah Jahan on the paper, there's also this very interesting example of Babur, who is said to have invented a whole new script, and he tried to push it pretty hard by making his sons try to learn it and sending his script to his sons for their marriage and birth anniversaries to Humayun and Kamran. But never quite. Babur is also known to have had sent copies of the Quran to Mecca in the Khate Babri. And I wanted to ask you, Carl, what would you say about all the Qurans that have been passed down to us today are mostly written in Arabic Nas or Suls. Do we find many copies of the Quran, say, written in the Sini script or Bihari script?
There are different scripts, and there are, of course, these miniature Qurans in the Hobari script, which means dust. In other words, the letters are the size of a grain of dust. It's almost impossible to read. And there are some magnificent ones that you find with unusual formations and compositions that are pictorial in North Africa and so forth. And of course, there is the wonderful tradition of calligraphic portraits of people, of animals, of birds, especially associated with the Bektashi Sufi order in the Ottoman regions.
One, we've just got it here for the contemporary. Yeah, I would just add some of the part of the contemporary trend, what is happening in today's India, and how even in Ajmer Shri, when we did this, the first Sufi Rang festival about 10 years back, that was the first exhibition in the 800 years history of the Dargah inside the Dargah. So at that time, some of the elders were very skeptical that how could an exhibition happen inside the Dargah with art and all. You know, it's not deliberately they were doing, but they were not aware of these kind of things. So when we did that, same elders tapped my back and said, this is something very amazing. And during the first exhibition, Professor Goswamy, we invited one of the calligraphers from Ahmedabad, and her name was Jana Anand. Hindu lady with special needs. She was in a wheelchair, wasn't able to hold but she made 99 canvases with the holy names of Allah, the Asma'ul Husna, and that was our first contribution as a calligrapher inside the Dargah. Over here, what Professor Karl was just talking about, depiction of animals or into the calligraphic or even some kind of human form. This is one of the contemporary artwork. And the person who had done this, he's not a calligrapher. He's an artist. So through Sufi Rang Festival, we try to invite those unknown artists whose neighbors wouldn't know that they are the calligraphers, give them a platform so that they can display their work to this 100,000 people who see them. During that 8 days, we do it during the Prophet's birthday time, so there are a lot of people coming in. An artist's best appreciation is how many people see his work.
Absolutely.
Doesn't matter it gets sold or not. And so this is contemporary work that we are trying to experiment and give even the artists who have no basic knowledge of calligraphic forms and the adab, but they are trying to invest their time and their art into calligraphic art, which has the spiritual connotations.
My question is to both Sadia and you about in the age of vanishing patronage and the advent of typography, how can our calligraphers be given the necessary boost to carry on their art?
You know, but that I think is true of any art today, because every art is struggling. You have a few people who are successful, and the case is very much similar across the world. You know, we've obviously lost the state patronages and whatever, but I think Islamic art and calligraphy in particular has suffered because of the language has suffered. But again, it's very much thriving in, say, in Pakistan or in other countries.
Turkey, Iran.
And young people like Salman, whose festival he invites me to every year. So there is I would say, we have many calligraphers now who are really doing that. And I know you're in hurry, but I have to say something, how honored I am to be with Karl Ernst, Mr. Goswamy, Salman, you. And I want to say this because Karl Ernst, I really wrote my book on the understanding of people like Karl Ernst, who've been luminaries in the field of Sufism. And when he came to my house, he gave me this book. I got him to sign a book. And just to come back to a central point in the art way, I'll never forget what he wrote. And on a book, I pulled out a dusty book of his, and he wrote, "How can I say this is my book?" And he told me that there is an Arabic saying, and I learnt that from Professor Ernst. When somebody asked me, "Oh, this is your book," I said, "No, this is not my book. I just wrote it." And I learned that from him. And I think he's a great Sufi, and I have to learn from him. And I wanted to say that Arabic expression that you use, that how do I say that this is mine?
كيف أقول هذا لي وما لي? How can I say this is mine when I have nothing?
That I think is the essence of calligraphy or anything.
Truly in today's contemporary times, it is still there are people who are working on, there's a festival that started in Delhi, the Rekhta. They are giving a good platform to these unknown artists. I was in China some time back. There are Chinese calligraphers. We invited them to Delhi some time back. And they are equally as good as writing the calligraphic art of China as well as the Arabic script. I have visited some of the Sufi centers in China where on one wall they have Arabic Quranic written, and the other wall they have exactly the same translation in Chinese calligraphy. I was in Iran some time back, and the new calligraphic fonts are still being invented. There's a very famous Ustad Habib Ajami from Tehran, recently, about a few years back, he invented a khat called Khat-e-Maula, which is actually a contemporary way of writing Kufic artwork. So Khat-e-Maula is doing very well. I got some of the artwork, but this was last minute setup. I would have loved to brought some of that here. But we can just run through some of the slides that we got before we have time for questions. I don't know. But in today's time, the contemporary artists are there. It's just that we all need to collectively have a shared platform where they can come out of their ghettos and they just feel accepted. Because even the neighbors, truly, when we invite artists to Ajmer Sharif, the neighbors don't know that they are calligraphers. That is a state that they're living in.
So, shall we keep the PPT rolling while we get some questions from the audience? Yes, please.
Hello, thank you. I just want to point out something regarding the Muslim context specifically. There's something essential that you seem to have missed, which is that the miracle of Islam is the miracle of the Word of God. So, in the religions of the book, which is Judaism and Christianity, the prophets were given a miracle to prove to people that they were truly the prophet of God. And so for Jesus, it was the resurrection, and for Moses, it was the parting of the Red Sea. For Muhammad, it was the poetry. So he stood on the streets of Mecca in a society of poet kings and he was an illiterate man. He was illiterate. He couldn't read or write. And he recited poetry that was far more sublime than anything that the Meccans had ever heard. And so this became the miracle of Islam. And the whole of Islamic sacred art was then born out of it. And a lot of art historians have misunderstood Islamic art as being iconographic. It's not. The symbols and the metonyms of Islamic art is the calligraphy in the same way that the cross...
What's the question? Sorry,
I'll get to it in a minute, okay? So I'm just... I'm quite surprised that you haven't taken this angle. And so if you now understand the calligraphy as iconography, as the symbol and metonym of the sacred in Islamic art, how would you then go about discussing the role of calligraphy, and not just calligraphy, but the arts of the book, as they've developed, particularly in India, and also in other countries where there have been a large Islamic or Muslim presence?
The question is not, wait, would you just, how was the art of calligraphy developed in other nations? Is that what you're trying to say? No. How was the art of calligraphy developed in... Right. So calligraphy as iconography, I think that's the key word.
As iconography.
What would you talk
icon
about?
symbolism, that's what you're asking about, how calligraphy developed. Also was taken as a symbolism of displaying one's longing towards the divine. So, yes.
I think I said that. I get. Can I answer that?
Please,
I think I did explain, and it started with that the Muslim experience of the divine is in the written word. And I repeated exactly what you're saying, that the experience of Christianity is in the cross, of the Hinduism it's in the idol, and the experience of God in Islam is the written word, and that's what.
Sorry, can we go to the next question, please? Sorry, we've got to cover some ground here.
There is
you over
something
there.
written in the
Yes,
mosque. It's like amounting to worship.
It's not a motive to worship. This is just glorification of God's message to humanity. And mosques, like I said, are usually, when you get inside a mosque, you find the feeling of emptiness. Because when nothing is present, God is present.
So do we have another question?
Yes, sir. Please.
Hi, thank you so much. So my question is actually related to the modern world, since a lot of the speakers brought it up. So do you think that because calligraphy was seen as something that was so sacred, that knowledge itself was sacred, do you think that could have been a reason why the printing press was not adopted as rapidly in India as it was in the West?
What was the last part?
Do you
The
think that
printing press, please repeat.
Sorry. So, would you say that the fact that calligraphy and knowledge is seen as sacred in the Islamic tradition is one reason why the printing press took a lot longer to emerge in the East as compared to how rapidly it was adopted in the West?
That's a speculative argument that's difficult to prove. Of course, there were a large number of, for instance, in the Ottoman Empire, professionals who were employed in writing manuscripts. And we know that in the 18th century, the price of a single Quran was between 2 and 7 cows in Anatolia, which means that they were very expensive and many places couldn't afford it. But I think that it's difficult to prove why people didn't do something. And so there was also an aesthetic argument because the first printing presses in Arabic script that were built in Venice in the 1500s, they had mistakes and they were considered ugly. And movable type was never happily accepted in the subcontinent because it's ugly, but it was lithography using calligraphic style in the Nastaliq form that was very popular in the 19th century. But I would just add one other example. Not everything is sacred. I met a wonderful calligrapher in Tunisia, Inja Mahtawi, who is a magnificent artist using calligraphy, but without words. Okay. It's abstract letters which do not connect, and he is phenomenal. Right. But he likes to talk about Ibn Arabi and the Sufis, nevertheless.
Much as we'd like to take more questions, I've got 6 of them. So anyway, we have to finish the session now. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you. Shall we take one last question? Can we take? No. Okay. No.